Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar to address critical issues, challenges, and solutions to ensuring equity is integrated into institutional decision-making and responses related to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Dr. Crystal Bedley, the project director for the ARC Network, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for registering for our ARC Network webinar. Before we begin, there's a few housekeeping items to take care of course. First, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all registrants as we will be uploading the recording to the ARC Network community platform at equityandstem.org. In terms of Zoom, I know many of us are much more comfortable with it nowadays, but just a short introduction to the platform. A couple of features that will be useful. First, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options. In the center are options for the Q&A and chat. So if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to populate the Q&A. That gives you an opportunity to upvote questions as well, that if you see another question that sparks your interest, and we can make sure to address those throughout today's conversation. And of course, the easiest way to share resources or to provide additional feedback is using the chat feature. Towards the end of today's webinar, we're going to be sharing links in the chat box, including our feedback survey. So please keep your eye on the chat, especially towards the end, so that you can have access to the different resources that are being made available today. And we'll allow for 5 to 10 minutes towards the end of the webinar for you all to ask the speakers a few questions. Unfortunately, we will not have live captioning for today's event. Captioning will be made available, though, when the recording is shared. Before we get into more specifics about today's webinar, I'm going to take a few more moments to talk to you about the ARC Network. So the goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners, all of us dedicated to gender equity in STEM and in the STEM professoriate in particular. As a STEM equity brain trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through a range of activities, including convenings, our curated online resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholars program, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Program, and the Association for Women in Science serves as a backbone organization. If you'd like to learn more about the ARC Network, if you're not familiar with us already, we encourage you to visit equityandstem.org, where you can join the community and be kept in the loop of our upcoming activities. The ARC Network is also built on a really valuable framework that integrates what we call the 3 I's, which stand for inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. To this end, we strive to ensure that our work accounts for different social stratifications that intertwine and determine the inequities that folks experience. And hopefully today will be one way in which you see that work play out. At this moment, I'd like to pass the mic over to Dr. Stephanie Page.
Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Stephanie Page. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for the ARC Network, and I'll be introducing our panelists and moderating today's conversation. But first, I want to give you a little bit of background on our webinar series. On June 4th of this year, the ARC Network convened a town hall to recognize the force of inequity and the disproportionate negative impacts that are novel to and exacerbated by the current pandemic. Relatively early on, racial, ethnic, and gender disparities were clearly identified within and out of academia. We sought to convene stakeholders in the drive for STEM equity in the academy to understand the top issues and challenges to integrating equity in decision-making. One outcome of that town hall is the development of this webinar series. Today's webinar will focus on the advocacy strategies for ensuring equity is integrated in institutional decision makers and other impactors of academia respond to the call of continuing higher education, research, and development in the face of an ongoing pandemic. We are welcomed by Dr. Sandra Soto and Dr. Jessi Smith. Sandra Soto is an associate professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona. She is known for her scholarship on Chicana and Latino literary and cultural studies, queer theory, racialized sexuality, and transnational feminisms. Dr. Soto's book, Reading Chican Like a Queer, The Demastery of Desire, replaces the race-based oppositional paradigm of Chicana literary studies with a less didactic, more flexible framework geared for a queer analysis of the discursive relationship between racialization and sexuality. Jessi Smith is a professor of psychology and associate vice chancellor for research at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. Her primary research expertise is on how societal norms and stereotypes undermine or support a person's motivational experience. Dr. Smith's NIH and NSF funded work has included longitudinal analyses of Native American and Latino student experiences in STEM, cross-sectional analyses of women's motivations for STEM, and theory-informed experimental interventions designed to change higher education in ways that foster sustainable diversity, equity, and inclusion. Welcome, Drs. Soto and Smith. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, thank you.
So we'll start, Dr. Smith, with a very special announcement that you wanted to make during today's seminar.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie, and to the ARC Network for hosting this really important topic. I wanted to start by acknowledging that the land on which we sit at our computers to gather collectively for this event today is stolen land from our Indigenous peoples. And here in Colorado Springs, the land I occupy, is on the unceded land of the Ute peoples. And I know that it's our obligation to unravel the harm to their elders and empower the present generation. This includes considering the disproportionate harm of the COVID-19 pandemic to our tribal communities. This is why I want to also acknowledge the extraordinary leadership and wisdom of Ernest House Jr., who is the Senior Policy Director at Keystone Policy Center and is an enrolled member of the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. He reminds us that in Indian country, broadband and internet is very limited. Remote working, telehealth, online school, not widely available. He is an inspiration in his commitment to protect our very vulnerable tribal communities. And so this acknowledgement, I hope, inspires a commitment from all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I guess we will jump right into our conversation today. You've already introduced an underlying theme. And so to start, there's historically been a need for advocacy around equity. What does advocacy mean in the time of COVID, and what motivates this sense of urgency? Sandy, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for that beautiful and really meaningful land acknowledgement, Jessi. That was really beautiful and different. It wasn't the usual land acknowledgement. I'm coming in from Tucson, Arizona, and am on the traditional Tohono O'odham land. So I would just like to add that. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming today, and to thank Heather Metcalf for the invitation to join you today. I'm a humanist and not a scientist, so I am honored to be part of this conversation. One of the things I would say about advocacy in times of COVID has to do with exactly that, what it means to accept an invitation to present some ideas, share some ideas with a group of people in a very different set of fields, in STEM fields. It has become crystal clear to me that advocacy during times of COVID must absolutely come from a place of difference, and must come from a place of humility. As I often do, before COVID, during COVID, in my classes and my presentations, I invoke or evoke the great Audre Lorde, who throughout her lifetime of amazing work said again and again in so many different ways that the only way to change social relations and end human suffering is to work at the point of difference. And so there's a lot of difference here in this Zoom. There's difference that is being brought into sharper relief during COVID pandemic times. There is your commitment in the ARC space to equity, which is also about difference, right? The difference that racialized scholars and students face at this moment. So humility and working across difference is itself, I would say, something that's really, really important to me during these moments. I imagine that the main reason that I was invited to participate in this forum today is because of my work at the University of Arizona to build a union, to unionize. And so I'm very happy to talk about that. One of the things that enabled my colleagues and I to build a union quickly, we built it really, really quickly in a red state, at a university that it had been unimaginable to think of unionizing in the past. There had been in 2001 effort, a very short-lived effort to unionize, but we were able to unionize pretty quickly on the heels of COVID, only because there had been pockets of activism before COVID. So it really does matter how we live our lives before a crisis confronts us. Because we had been so, when I say we, I mean a loose group of faculty and largely graduate students had been organizing on this campus for a variety of reasons the years leading up to COVID. We were able to reassemble fairly quickly and with trust when the university first started to announce very draconian furloughs, pay cuts, and more importantly, when they started to lay off hundreds of our colleagues at the University of Arizona. The main thing I would say that is important and that I'll be talking about throughout the time that we have together today is refusing individualism. And that is so hard to do. It's very easy to say that neoliberalism and privatization encourage us to think in individual ways, and that the university is incredibly, incredibly cutthroat and hierarchical and feeds on and expects that individualism. But now we really have to, I think, under times of COVID, which is about life and death, right? And a vulnerability to premature death. When it's a matter of life or death, it becomes really clear that the only way to effectively advocate for people's lives is what we call wall-to-wall, meaning not just as faculty, but as faculty, staff, janitors, graduate students, university, bookstore employees. And so that's largely what I've been doing. To do that means a lot of different things. I have my timer going, by the way, because I can be long-winded. So I don't want to take up too much time on this question. I want to make sure I don't cut into Jessi's time. But it means taking care of ourselves first, getting enough sleep, trying to do what we can to not put ourselves as activists, as advocates in harm's way in relation to COVID, right? It means wearing masks. It means not going out into public spaces unless we absolutely have to. And then showing up for our students, our colleagues, the people on campus who clean the buildings, the people on campus who I would call, and my colleagues in the union would call, essential workers. It also means learning from and acting from a place of grief rather than in spite of grief and loss, but really coming at the advocacy from within grief and harnessing the grief. That is the grief. I've had incredible, like many of the people here, I'm sure, have had incredible losses during COVID. I've lost my mother, I've lost my father, I've lost an uncle. bam, bam, bam. And it could be very debilitating to have lost so many people who were very close to me. And it has been debilitating, but it's been possible for me, and I don't want to speak for everyone who's suffering loss, because we all grieve differently for sure. And whatever path people need to take for their grieving process is their path, and I have no judgment. For me, it's been important to harness that grief towards social justice. And I'll stop there for now.
Such a poignant opening. Thank you so much for being so exposed. Jessi, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the question.
Yes, thank you. And Sandy, my goodness, my heart just broke in 100 more pieces. This has been a difficult week. This has been a difficult month. This has been a difficult year. And I don't have an answer for what advocacy looks like, because I can't figure out which tragedy to focus on. And so I shared that because hearing you talk, Sandy, about humility really resonates with my approach as well. And for me, what that looks like is accepting that we do not know the answers. This is uncharted territory. So how can we know what advocacy looks like right now? Because nobody's done this before. And so for me, that humility to just say, I feel like we're being set back 100 years, 50 years, but we're gone back in time. And so I'm not afraid to pull out any old tricks, try new tricks, and see what happens. And so I guess for me, that's what humility has translated to in my advocacy, is sort of forgiving myself for not getting it right, not knowing what to do, but feeling like we got to try something. So one of those things that it looks like for me in my space, so where I come from, my positionality, right, is I'm both a faculty member, I'm a full professor, and I'm an administrative leader. I'm in a research leadership position. I'm also relatively new to this university, which is difficult. I've been here for just over 2 years. And so I don't have the friendships that I would have had for, decades at my previous institution. So what that means is that my network is both the big one that it's always been, but it also feels much smaller. And so figuring out how to activate your networks in these new spaces has been really important and very valuable to figure out how do we work together, the ARC network being a great example of that in those new spaces. So what does that mean? So we have to think of, there's multiple goals. There's the goals we've always had around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And now, as Sandra's pointed out, we've got well-being to add to this list, which was always there, but we never really, it's not called EWIW, which, right? Is it part of inclusion? Kind of, but well-being is pretty specific. And I love that notion of turning that inward too and caring for ourselves and our own. But there's these multiple contexts. So in the academic community, how does COVID impacting our labs, our classrooms, our field sites, our departments, our conferences, right? And all of those are spaces where advocacy should be happening to mitigate this pandemic, to mitigate racial injustice, to mitigate election uncertainty, and then recognizing people's multiple domains of practice. So that's something I'm constantly challenging myself to not just focus on research. That's where I happen to be a leader at my university on, but there are multiple domains of practice. Teaching, what does that look like? Mentoring, and now we have to add caregiving and elder care and homeschooling and being technology savvy in ways that our community might not have been. So those are important spaces for advocacy. And at the end of the day, I've been trying to really think about how to do advocacy around COVID in these different multiple levels, right? So we always think about, the organization, but what does that mean, right? We're not physically in our buildings, at least we're not here at UCCS. So what is the organization? I mean, it's mind-blowing. I'm not a sociologist. I need one right now because we keep thinking of organizational change And we've taken away the physical space that we've usually used to define those boundaries. So now advocacy during COVID has to include our homes. It might still include our office buildings for those still, as you pointed out, all of our essential workers who are going to campus. It might include libraries where that's the only place you can get a strong internet connection. So those multiple analysis spaces, and those are the kinds of questions I ask for myself. Where can advocacy happen and what does it look like? I've been really trying to be proactive. And I think, again, humility to know I can't predict it all. I don't have all the answers, but just trying to figure out, okay, if I were to make a map of all of those things I just said and all the ways they intersect with every different level of power and intersectionality, where can I do something? How can I insert something? And so that's my general approach at the moment, which is it feels everywhere. And I know that for the community that's listening, that can seem overwhelming, but I offer it actually as a space to say, so anywhere is fine. No one spot has been untouched. And so it's okay to pick a spot that you feel comfortable with, or that you're curious about, or that you feel is really suffering or in need, whatever feels safe to you, but pick a space and do something. And I feel for myself that that actually feeds back into my well-being, right? I'm like, okay, I'm doing something. And we can talk about some of those specific strategies later.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm just bringing up our next question so that our audience can see. And it's interesting, and you just laid this beautiful foundation for what I think so many people are going through right now. There's so many different layers to advocacy, and where can it happen, and where should we devote our energy? And you know, Sandy brought up the fact that there was just this really rapid movement around unionizing. So our next question really does have to do with application of some of these specific strategies. I chuckled a little bit when you said kind of going back and pulling out some of the old tricks. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this question specifically. Would you like to start, Sandra?
Sure.
Sorry.
Sure. No, that's fine. Yeah, I'll start with some specific strategies that I have used, and I think I'll go ahead and share my screen for a sec so that you can see. Okay, so let me go to a different slide here. I'll come back to this slide momentarily. Oops. Okay, this is two quotes from a blog post that I highly recommend that everybody read. It's the recommended reading that I did share with Stephanie, and so I'm sure that it will be distributed even just in a slide at the end of today's webinar, but I want to hit the framing of the piece. The first couple of sentences and the last few sentences. And it also ties into it being Kathy Davidson, the author's argument here, ties into what I was saying earlier about coming from a place of grief and loss rather than in spite of. This is a short piece, the single most essential requirement in designing a fall online course that Kathy wrote last summer in thinking about, as the title suggests, how do we pivot, as they say, those of us especially who aren't used to teaching online. And her very first two sentences here: let's start the week by repeating that a summer of planning for better online learning this fall will be wasted if we do not begin from the premise that our students are learning from a place of dislocation, anxiety, uncertainty, awareness of social injustice, anger, and trauma. So are we. And she ends the piece with, whatever you are feeling and experiencing, it's likely your students are too, and probably in a greater degree. If you as a professor are having a hard time concentrating, being productive, think about a student just beginning the way to mastery who suddenly has to stay focused on a field, a subject that seems utterly tangential to their traumatized lives at home, with parents, no job, internship canceled, paying tuition for a bunch of idiotic videos, etc., etc. And I take this this approach that Kathy has, and when you read the blog, I hope you will read the blog post later on your own time. But when you go through it, you'll see some very specific ideas for structuring the class in the way that she is suggesting from a place of trauma, completely changing our assignments, completely revamping our syllabi, not just trimming, but really thinking about what is possible on Zoom that is not, what we can do on Zoom and what we can't do on Zoom. For me, I teach classes that are heavily theoretical, that have a lot of feminist theory. I've had to completely change that this semester, and I'm in the process now of developing, like I'm sure you are, my syllabi for the spring. And my feminist theories seminar, I'm having trouble with, because I cannot ask my graduate students to read the same level of theory than they would have been reading in a face-to-face, intense, embodied seminar. But also, this semester, I'm teaching one of those very large gen ed classes. It's called Gender and Contemporary Society. I have 3 TAs, breakout sessions on Fridays, and 111-ish students, most of whom actually show up amazingly. I don't even take attendance, but they show up, almost all of them, every Monday and Wednesday for synchronous meeting times. And it means that I start by very clearly sharing this Davidson piece with them, having them think about what it means to start from a place of trauma, letting them know that whether we like it or not, we're gonna build some intimacy in this space. We just, by virtue of losing people, by virtue of being worried about paying rent or mortgages, we're going to bring a certain kind of energy to Zoom that is gonna create intimacy, for better or for worse. I can't tell you how much they appreciate this and the carrying it through all semester long. And sometimes, when a student, I hear a student's voice quivering, sometimes stopping and saying, okay, we're not going to discuss the essay that I asked you to look at for today. We're going to check in with each other, which is not easy in a Zoom space of 110 or so people. A lot of my students are POC. A lot of my students are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so I also start from a place of really grounding Ruthie Gilmore's definition of racism. Racism is the state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. This is the best definition of racism that I know of. It's the one that I use in my own work and teaching, and it has never been more important to discuss, I would say, and I bet Ruthie would say too, than in this moment that we are living in, a moment in which we are all globally, as you know, vulnerable to COVID, but not in the same ways. We know that Black people, Native peoples, and Latinos, Latinx are vulnerable in particularly charged ways. We know that it's interesting that men, especially men of color, are not more likely to contract COVID, but more likely to die of it if they do contract it. So starting from this place in my classrooms of trauma, of what it means to think about vulnerability to premature death as not natural, right? It's human made. And then thinking about our place in the institution, in the academy. What is our responsibility as scholars and as teachers, not the students now, but us as faculty, as scholars, as graduate students? What is our responsibility to hold our institutions accountable to the very ways that we elaborate this vulnerability or are indifferent to it? I'm very critical of higher education as it stands, and I don't want anything like what we've had. I don't want the same tenure system. I don't want the same promotion systems. I don't want the same individualism. And one way that, again, going back to concrete strategies, that the union, our new union, United Campus Workers of Arizona, one thing that we are doing is holding the administration accountable to shared governance, but not in the usual way, not business as usual, where you have faculty senate who might make a recommendation. No recommendations. We're through with that. That's why we unionized. We are, and I'd be interested, it's interesting, Jessi, that you're having both hats on, the faculty and the administrator hat. But we are having the administrators explain to us why they deserve to administrate. Like, what is it about the president, the provost, the chief financial officer, the deans? Who are they? Who put them in charge? How are they making decisions? Are they following state law, as you see here, that requires them to listen to faculty? This is just a visual for you. The union that we now have grew out of a grassroots effort called CAWA, the Coalition for Academic Justice. And I just wanted you to see the very first flyer that I put together. I wanted it to look pretty grassroots-ish, kind of DIY, do it yourself, a little bit punk, because I wanted to acknowledge from the beginning our scrappiness, and that this wasn't going to be a polished PowerPoint kind of movement, but an actual wall-to-wall movement. And on the right here, this is a screenshot from Twitter. Is one of the many images that my colleague Rux has made for CAWA and our union that is hand rendered. She's a beautiful artist and intellectual and activist and scholar, professor, and she makes many of our ephemera, many of our flyers. And I think that the hand renderedness is really important, again, for showing not just scrappiness. I mean, I'm not sure if you know what I mean, or even what I know what I mean by scrappiness, but just that this is something new and untried, and it's not untried at other universities, although most unions at other universities are not wall to wall. This is taking, again, humility. I have learned more in working in CAWA and the union from the staff. Man, talk about humility. I thought I knew staff concerns. I didn't. I thought I knew contingent faculty concerns, graduate student concerns. I really didn't. And for me, it means learning to listen really well. It means learning to shut up. I have to, in my union meetings, learn to use what's called stack. I don't know if you ever use stack in the chat, but I'm not allowed to speak until I'm a tenured faculty member. So I can't speak until the very end of the meeting. And that's really hard because faculty members are such loudmouths, right? And we think we know everything. And I'm also having to spend a lot of time in trainings where I thought I was an activist because, and I was an activist, but the union is like, hey, if you want to recruit for us, you have to be trained. You don't know how to recruit, believe us. And sure enough, I knew nothing about recruitment for the union. So it's so fun. I hope you'll do it if there is a union at your institution or think about doing it. I'll stop there.
Wow. Not only has my head been shaking this entire webinar, but I have been doing like the rapid blinking to keep tears from just flooding from my eyes. There was so much that you said, and Jessi, I think there's also the highlight of your being an administrator too. That makes me even more interested to hear, your response to the question and to some of what Sandy was saying.
Well, I can summarize it. I'm a little bit punk, so I totally know what you mean, Sandy. That really resonates. It is interesting to, I'm a full-time administrator. I'm the chief of research. And what that means, though, is that I'm in the spaces that Sandy is just talking about where decisions can get made. So I have an obligation to constantly say new things, try new things, and do new things. Knowing full well that at any time, my bosses could decide they don't like what I'm doing, and I would have to stand down, right? So that's a real thing that you have to figure out. It's sort of, you mentioned, I was also reading Lord's books again, and it's like that master's tool sort of notion of, okay, well, I really only have those tools in front of me right now. So how can I use them effectively if I'm going to help during COVID? So some examples of what this looks like is everything from the logistics of how do we return to campus? What does that look like? Who has access, right? Because there's equity issues there. It's not just, I wasn't responsible for writing all of the plans for how we get our scientists back on campus first, because all their cells are going to die, their animals are going to die. Like there's actual life that happens in the bench sciences. So I need to make sure that they can have access to that. On the other hand, I have to make sure that their graduate students, they don't feel the pressure to collect the data the way they've had to collect it, or that they have to go in when they don't feel safe to go in because their faculty mentor is saying, you need to go in and feed the animals. So constantly saying and speaking up and writing sample communications for the university to send out that clearly states, and from what I understand about EDI, to say, making sure we're taking care of that pressure, removing those, trying our very best to attend to those power differences. I was put on a logistics team, which meant I was having to figure out what the stickers on the floor would look like. Now you might think, all right, well, I wondered who did that. So you're making stickers, and you know what they say? Stand 6 feet apart, which is ableist, right? And what if you can't see the sticker because you're visually impaired, right? So now what are you gonna do? So these were the kinds of places where I could say, again, all right, we just turned the clock back 100 years, and now we need to remember ADA. And we need to make sure that we literally have accessible campuses for those who need to come. So access to campus also really came down for me during COVID, and this is still ongoing as we're working remotely still, and it's about communication. And I think all of us have some sort of core group that we can communicate with, whether it's your people in your department, whether it's a student group, whether it's a community nonprofit that you're part of, whatever the space is. I try to over communicate, which is well, you have to do anyway in academia, but especially now, and to make sure that I was really writing documents and statements that I could be proud of, that could draw on from what I understand about humility and intersectionality and power, but to be reassuring and to put boundaries and to give people permission to sort of let themselves off the hook. So that brings up a really important spot. You mentioned tenure, the tenure system. So one of the things that I've been really trying to figure out, how do we advocate, what does that look like within our tenure structures? So I went, many universities did this. They're like, okay, well, we'll stop the tenure clock, right? Okay, so, and you could make sure we could sort of go back in time to back when all of us spent years and years and years trying to do work on stop the clock for parental or family leave. And then we figured out, oh, okay, it needs to be opt out. Okay, so that lesson learned, let's make sure that when we do stop the clock for tenure, that we pay attention and try to do it in these good ways. And remember, now I'm like reflecting, going, well, stopping the clock is going to lead to more pay inequity. Now we won't have women and people of color faculty being promoted as soon. And so now they won't be in positions of power. Like, is this really the best solution? So I'm actually doubting now all that work we did, 10 years ago to stop the clock stuff and how it applies now in COVID. And what's so interesting is we've got this national crisis to stop the national clocks. Like, it's always been a very personal life transition. Do I stop the clock or not? Is this how do I feel? And now we've got the university stopping clocks for hundreds of people at a time who have to make choices about opting out or not. So as an example of, and this is my overall strategy, is I went back, reread everything I could from the literature on stop the clock, and then I got the data. I wanted to know who stopped the clock on our campus. Where did they come from? What departments were they in? What does their identities look like, right? How close in time were they to their review? And nobody asked me to do that, right? I just thought, here's a space. I know a lot about stop the clock from my other work back in the day. And so let me see what I can learn and apply here. And so I've taken those data, I've analyzed it, I've written it up like I would an article, so that now I can also share what we've experienced at UCCS and learned and try to disseminate that for our community. So and that is my activism strategy. I'm a read, research, try it out, data analyze it, write it, repeat. And so that's just an example of what data might be going at your organization. What might you have access to that you could use on your own volition to make sense of this. And also for me, I think, what does next year look like? So we stopped the clock for a year, and I'm actually, as the research officer, I know darn well that all the productivity that's happening this year was stuff people did 2 years ago. You collected those data 2 years ago, and you've been writing it up for a year, and it was under review for another 6 months. So right now, this year actually might look okay, because you're really getting, our annual reviews are bizarre, right? They're like 2 years ago. But what about next year? So another strategy, so this is my chain of thought, was, okay, well, we got to get out in front of next year. And we need to do it now, because I'm weirdly concerned about a short memory of pandemic times and everything that this year has meant. So if I wait till next year to do this, if I wait till 2022 when we're doing the next round of evaluations for 2021, it's too late. So I was like, okay, who's got examples of what to send evaluators when someone stops the clock? That led me down this rabbit hole, trying to find good examples of how do we already know to contextualize. Don't look at years of service, try to actually just look at what is presented in front of you. And I took that, and with some wordsmithed it to heck with some of my friends in the network, whether from the advanced community or the art community. And then we shared it. I said, all right, we got something. Let's send it out. It's not perfect. it's not going to fit every university. But again, that notion of taking what we used to do, trying to predict what to do now, and then just putting it out into the universe has been my strategy for a specific strategy. I wrote down, as Sandy was talking, something that really resonated, which was trying to make sure we're having wellness around our students and wellness around our staff and our faculty. And so the last thing I'll say is, oftentimes, depending on which of those spaces you occupy, that's where your blinders are. And so what I hope you can be inspired to do as a strategy is to invite people in those staff positions or who are students and have a conversation over Zoom, right? It's not beautiful, but it is what it is, to find out and listen and see what else can we do? How can I be supported? And often we don't know. They're like, I don't know how you can help, but at least we're listening and can be heard, which is what I know Sandy was really emphasizing as well. And that notion of shared governance, it's like, I want to change it to something else, right? Like shared community or shared grievance, right? Like we're all grieving together during this time or whatever it might be. So I think that finding the spaces where you are and then just putting yourself out there. I'm not worried or nervous about retaliation. I have that luxury. I'm so lucky that I don't. But I always also tell my provost what I'm doing, right? So that is a particular space because I'm an administrator. I don't want my provost to find out after the press gets a hold of it that I just did an expose of the UCCS Stop the Clock data. That I would have done that as just a faculty member, but in this space. So being sure to just be transparent. And that's been really valuable to be transparent in what I'm trying to do. And trying to push those impact statements, those evaluation letters that can we send out? How can I get those into the hands of deans and department chairs who are the change makers who have responsibility for seeing those through? And so again, just communication over and above what we were already trying to do.
This is really great, and we've had the chat popping off on this topic specifically about stopping the clock. So I just wanted to add some of that commentary, and people are really excited to see the statement that you were mentioning that you wrote. We also have a couple of questions regarding bold or creative ideas. I think it's really an empathizing experience to say that, well, we thought about this, we implemented it, we found it was wrong, we went back, right, which we usually don't do, to make sure we're doing this right. And I'm curious if you could talk about bold and creative strategies or ideas about stopping the clock, as well as some key takeaways from the research that you have been doing. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So my idea, which is untested, is that instead of stopping the clock, right, that we say you're staying on the same timeline, and we're going to ensure that you are not penalized for all of the time you spent revamping your classes this summer, all of the not writing you did because you're too stressed out. So essentially, it's a stop the clock without stopping it, right? So instead of saying you're going to be evaluated for the 7 years, how about we say, let's go ahead and just call 2020 over, and you will be evaluated on 6 years worth of information. It's just that's bold, right? And even though I know everybody in the planet understands the pandemic has happened, I am incredibly nervous that they will forget in 2, 3, 4 years when some of these very, very junior faculty are coming up for review. So that means that we have to actually put this in our official documentation. So that is one very bold strategy that I would like to see. We have talked about on our campus, what would happen if we just now retroactively totally changed everybody's workload distribution. We said in 2020, you were 90% teaching and 10% anything else you would like it to be. Because even if you only had one class that you were teaching, you know, Sandy, your experience of how you have your TAs, you have the students themselves, you are now, you have this new platform, all of those things, even if it was just one class with your 110 students, you've just described how complex that is and how hard that is. Let alone, what if you have 3 classes? And now spring is looking the same way, right? At least at our university, we're talking about, do we cancel spring break or not? So to say, could we go back in time and just say everybody's workloads is their teaching, and we are definitely not using the same teaching evaluations that we've used.
I really think that's, yeah, sorry to cut you off, but I just wanted to jump on that and say, yeah, like I think that we can't do tenure anymore in the way that we used to do tenure, not just because of COVID, but because of the disinvestment in higher ed by states and by the federal government. And so I was just in a webinar as an audience member yesterday for my college. I'm in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and our dean was talking to us about the dire budget situation and how our college is going to have to shrink. And one of the things that he said is, we need to teach more, we need to teach more. The dollars follow tuition. The dollars follow students. They don't follow research. Like the grants and that sort of thing, that's not, it's all to 85% of our budget comes from tuition. And so it's really going to change the way that we think about Research One institutions. U of A is a Research One institution, but it's clear that we're being told that if we want our colleges to survive, we need to really focus on teaching right now. And so it would be really horrible if the tenure requirements didn't reflect that shift in thinking. I mean, meanwhile, we should be advocating for reinvestment in the institution so that people do have support for research. But yeah, I like the idea of changing the work requirements. I mean, the work
distribution. Yeah. You know, what's interesting, and I'll jump on what you just said there too. I just want to, and this is just my vantage point, of course, but for many, myself included, research is what brings me joy. Research is what fills me up. And luckily, I do research on really terrible topics, and so I'm weirdly used to downer research. And for those of us who do this kind of work and you're like, woohoo, there's a terrible significant difference in my data, it's a strange mental thing that happens when you're like, I'm going to now spend a year writing about this horrible inequity and reviewing literature that just details all the other horrible inequities. And while I've been writing this paper on Stop the Clock, I'm looking at all this COVID stuff coming out on the research on the impacts of COVID on research, right? Research on research. And it is depressing and awful in all the ways that you know. And I didn't want to stop working that day. Like, I was happy to sit on my butt in front of my computer for hours and hours and hours because it brought me joy. It brought me joy to be reading, chasing people's citations down, looking at a news article. And so I also, if I could be bold and creative, would love to think of a way that we keep the eye on what brings people joy. And for some, it's teaching. For some, it's research. For some, it might be their service and their leadership. And so the other ideal would be, how can we allow people more flexibility, essentially, to define for themselves in this moment that it's that, you know, at our school, it's 40-40-20, as if we are just so equally split like this. And that's not the reality, it never was, but now more than ever, could we give it to the people to say what makes the most sense for you, and how can we make sure that you still get joy out of what you're doing? Because it's really hard to find any of that right now.
Wow. Aspen, are there any more questions in the Q&A that you thought we should highlight?
Yeah, so I'm curious, people seem to really resonate with this idea of restructuring or revaluing and reassessing what we're doing. I'm curious if you could just talk a bit more in the question talks about the snowball effect, right? If you don't collect data now, well, that leads into not being able to analyze it, and it just feels like it pushes things so far into the future, which ties to not getting grants, et cetera. Can you dig a bit more into the reassessment of productivity and the evaluation systems that we are seeing right now?
Yeah, I'll talk for a few minutes, and then I bet Sandy and the union folks are really in a wonderful position to articulate what that could look like, that notion of it being systemic. So we are trying out what are called COVID impact statements. They're not mandatory. So I think our approach at the university right now has been to appeal to the autonomy that most in higher ed really value and love, but to do it in a way that sort of strongly encourages. We don't want that pushback or that reactance to say this is mandatory, but those COVID impact statements, which were inspired actually from one of the past ARC network webinars where that was in that toolkit that was shared. And it's an opportunity for a faculty member for themselves to write down the things in this moment, right today, that are being impacted because of COVID. Is it they couldn't take graduate students this year. They couldn't go to their field site. They couldn't travel like they normally travel to go meet their colleagues and work on their book together. Whatever it is, and to do it now. And then that becomes part of your portfolio. And you have the autonomy to edit it, to change it, to take it out completely if you wanted to. But I feel pretty strongly that because there's, I'm a social psychologist and so it means at the individual level, everybody's got their own story. And here's an opportunity to take an organizational idea, a COVID impact statement, but to give it to the person. I don't want to tell you how I think your research was impacted or your teaching or service were impacted, but I want to provide that structure. Sandy, are there things that are happening with the union to negotiate that?
Not yet. There may be, but I happen to be on a university-wide committee to reevaluate the annual review, and because ABOR, the Arizona Board of Regents, it turns out does not mandate an annual review. They mandate other reviews, but not the annual review. I always thought that we did this because ABOR forced us to do the annual review. But in any case, we are doing something similar, Jessi, which is to encourage faculty to, in their annual review, just make visible all of this invisible labor that review committees won't be able to see otherwise. And we know from research in gender and women's studies and sociology that the kind of labor that we're really suddenly flooded with is largely affective labor. Well, a lot of it is technological, like how do you use Zoom, but the kind of labor I was talking about earlier in relation to Kathy Davidson's piece on starting from a place of trauma, I'm exhausted after one of those just 50-minute classes, because when you have students who are losing family members, it requires you to show up in a certain way. And so that kind of labor is usually women's labor. And women's labor is the hardest to see, right? And it's completely in our homes now. So yeah, it's definitely a feminist issue as well. I don't know how to answer the question of productivity that your guest asked about, data. Also, we in the humanities, we work very differently than scientists do, for sure.
Wow. I'm still wowed, and I'm sure everyone can see the water welling in my eyes. This has been such an incredible conversation. At first and foremost, want to say thank you, Jessi and Sandy, for the incredible amount of vulnerability and exposure and humility that you shared with us today and that you displayed today. I am clearly profoundly touched. As we transition to Crystal to close us out today, I do want to take a brief moment to show our audience some of the resources that were discussed today. And actually, you both have overlapping resources in some of the books that that Jessi has shared Sandy talked about them a little bit or referred to them a little bit today. So I will do that. And as I'm doing that, Crystal will prepare to close this out. So I am going to share screen again. And wow, just thank you so much. And so here we have the reference from Kathy Davidson that Sandy brought up. I also dropped that in the chat earlier, and this will be sent to everyone in our follow-up emails. And then we also have from Jessi some of the resources that she wanted to share with our audience today. And again, we will make sure that these are sent out in our follow-up communications with attendees today. So thank you again, and I will transition to Crystal.
Great, thank you. Let me get my hands on that diversity resistance book, right? In so many ways, it feels like what you've shared today is really leading the resistance. You've given us so much food for thought. I really feel like we're just getting started. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you all, with everyone at ARC, about how we can continue to push for greater equity and to leverage this moment in particular to make that change happen, right? I feel in some ways that there was no greater moment to do it than now. The time is now. And so thank you for reminding us of that. Once again, thank you, Dr. Soto and Dr. Smith, for your time this afternoon, and especially for doing the critical work on the ground and having the conversation. Thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today. As always, your input is valuable. It is invaluable in many ways and valuable to us. So if you could please fill out our feedback survey. We see some folks have shared some comments in the chat. We appreciate those as well and are grateful for everyone's participation. The link to our feedback survey is now available in the chat. So please click on that. It'll take you 5 minutes tops to do it. So I always encourage folks to do it now. And in this time of uncertainty, I will hope we all can rely on our collective vision and mission for a more equitable and just future in the professoriate and beyond. And thank you all today for your time. It was a real pleasure.